Hi everyone and welcome to the Music Professor channel. I'm here today with my faithful assistant Loki, who has his blue coat on because the weather's getting a bit chillier now, so he's got that to keep him warm. And I'm also delighted to have Ian Coulter with me, who is my wonderful assistant and my partner on the channel, and he's behind the camera. So say hello, Ian.
Hello.
And here we are doing another feature. Today the topic will be genius, very broadly, and I'll tell you all about what's in my mind. I'm slightly improvising today's discussion. A lot of our recent videos have been almost like sort of, I don't know, cultural commentary. And I realise, you know, there's more to this channel than this kind of thing, but it's very interesting. And we're going to be following a few ideas about what genius is today. I wanted to say something about Patreon and about donations, because you're all so wonderful. You leave such amazing comments. There's so much encouragement for this channel. We feel all your love for us. That's really wonderful. Please consider giving to the channel, because these days with so little sort of intelligent discussion about culture and classical music or music in general on media and social media, it can get a bit depressing. And those of us who are trying to provide content like this for free, you know, this isn't a wealthy or particularly well-resourced channel. So we would enormously value any donations you may wish to give to us, and the details of how to donate to the channel are below in the video description. Okay, so today's discussion is sort of asking the question, what is genius? And I realise that the word is so open-ended, it's almost impossible to define. And I'm also mindful of the fact that when Igor Stravinsky was asked about the word genius, he said, "I detest it. It's a form of propaganda." And I fully understand his problem. It's a word that he would have associated with romanticism. The modern meaning of the word evolved in the 18th century and really took hold in the 19th century with these sort of huge figures who'd rise up and you'd say, ah yes, there's an example of genius. It was common to view someone like Isaac Newton or Napoleon. You know, these were considered these sort of huge figures. And of course Beethoven in music had that status very early on in the 19th century, almost before he died. He'd taken on a kind of grand status. But the original meaning of the word is this idea of an attendant spirit who's there to kind of facilitate a person's natural abilities so that they can excel at what they're doing. It's that sort of idea. And it gradually took on in the 18th century and into the 19th century, this idea of a person, the idea of the spirit started to recede at around the same time as the power of organised religion started to recede, so that you had more this notion that the individual human being was endowed with this spectacular gift. So the genius no longer really is an attendant spirit, but it's more to do with the individual manifesting some kind of astonishing thing. And we all know what that means because we can observe it. You know, you only have to look at Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel or whatever. that is a famous example, isn't it, where it's kind of jaw-dropping the extraordinary and you go, oh wow. And it happens with human creativity a lot. It's very interesting with this in mind to look at Francis Ford Coppola, who I talked about a couple of weeks ago in a recent interview, talking about what he thinks about genius.
Why don't we ever say the truth, which is we're geniuses? This is a genius species. What we can do, our language that we speak, we have decoded the genome.
So however we respond to Coppola's definition there, I do love the fact that there you have this legendary director in his 80s making these wonderfully optimistic remarks about the human species, and that's kind of delightful. But of course, despite what he says, and there's much truth in what he says, but there's also this sense that some individuals are certainly endowed with even more talent than others, if I can put it that way. And sometimes, almost inevitably, that endowment of talent actually has to do with certain advantages that individuals had when they were young, in terms of the way that they were trained or that they learned the thing that they're good at. I'll give you a famous quotation from Beethoven here. When Beethoven was asked about Mozart, he said something very interesting. And it's very much not what modern observers say about Mozart, but it is what Beethoven said. He said Mozart had the advantage of having a father who made sure he was properly trained. In other words, Beethoven in that remark is somewhat envious of the child Mozart, whose father trained him in a very disciplined way, so that when he was a boy, he was already enormously accomplished. Beethoven's dad didn't do those things. He was a bit of a drunkard, he was a charlatan, and poor Beethoven had a miserable childhood. And his father kind of tried to make him into a child prodigy. He tried to sort of force him to be a prodigy. So there's all of that tied in with it. But the interesting thing is the view of Leopold sort of over exploiting his son's gifts, that very much the modern conception isn't that terrible. Now, I don't know if I'm going to make a judgment about what Leopold Mozart did in the 1750s and 60s. All I can say is that Mozart was trained very thoroughly, and his genius, if you like, seems to have risen out of that early training. So following on from all this stuff about Mozart, the next thing to say is the reason why I originally wanted to make this discussion was that there are two programmes actually on the BBC. In the video description, I'm going to put the links to the programmes because they're both interesting. One of them was a series of programmes on BBC Two. The link is below in the video description. The programme is called, I'm just looking at my computer, Mozart, Rise of a Genius. And it was a sort of, I don't know how to describe it, there were elements of docudrama, but mainly it was celebrities of various kinds talking to camera about Mozart. And I thought the programme was a weird mixture of good and terrible. The terrible was that you had celebs, you know, turning up going, oh, Mozart, he's so wonderfully, so brilliant. And they might have a sort of hint of a tear because they've just been listening to something. It's all very well, and I know why TV shows are made like this, but I find this notion of celebrities telling me that something matters is, in a way, the laziest form of communication possible. That doesn't mean anything, does it? The reason why you believe something is because you're convinced, and you can't be convinced just because someone else tells you, oh, Mozart's wonderful. That won't cut it for me. However, on the plus side, the programme did have amazing things. There was a beautiful moment in the last episode when Stephen Fry, admittedly a celebrity, but nevertheless he had something very interesting to say. He said, he started talking about an extraordinary thing, which was Mozart's elegy that he wrote for his pet starling, which died a week after his father died. And Mozart seems to have poured a certain amount of poetic energy into this elegy that he wrote for the starling, and he got his friends to perform a sort of burial cemetery when they laid to rest the pet starling. And in a weird way, it's kind of moving, but it's also a bit weird. And he realised that in the process of writing this elegy about the starling, he seemed to be projecting his sense of loss about his father, but he wasn't really admitting that. It's all rather fascinating. And it was moments like that that the programme was incredibly revealing about Mozart, the human being. There's also a wonderful moment at the end when David McVicar, the opera director, who, you know, has a terrific career in terms of productions of Mozart's operas. And at the end of the final episode, he's trying to just distill how he feels about Mozart, and all he can do is well up because there's something so extraordinary about Mozart that he's kind of overwhelmed. Almost like a sublime response. He's overwhelmed by Mozart, so he starts welling up. It's really a wonderful moment because you realise, yes, that's why Mozart matters. There's something incredibly special, incredibly relevant about this person. And that's, if you like, that's the definition of genius, the ability to be a human being who lived in the 1780s and is still relevant today. And that's why he's worth celebrating. So I said there were two TV programmes. The second one, also in the links in the video description, is also a British show called Ludwig, also on the BBC. Very different show, but weirdly, there's some degree of compatibility between the Mozart thing and the Beethoven thing, because you've got Mozart on the one hand and Ludwig. Beethoven is a sort of absent presence, if I can put it that way. He's kind of there in the show, although he's not mentioned by name, I don't think. But the program's called Ludwig, so I won't tell you anything about it except that it's about solving puzzles in the real world in terms of crime. And the main character, who's played by David Mitchell, is in a sense a kind of a genius figure. He fulfills some of the sort of stereotypes of genius. He's actually a little bit hopeless as a human being, which I think is true in terms of how people endowed with extraordinary gifts often are. He's a bit useless, but then he suddenly can solve things in this amazing way. So that's a lot of fun, and you see him solving various crimes through the series. But the soundtrack, a friend of mine said, oh, discuss the soundtrack on your channel. So I'll do that very quickly. The soundtrack, which has annoyed a lot of people, is actually rather brilliant. It's been put together by, I think, a couple of people who are electronic sort of studio musicians. So they created the score largely in the studio out of scraps of Beethoven. And I think they've done it kind of ingeniously. The reason why people are annoyed by the score, it's not really that they've adapted Beethoven in this way. It's that this is interesting. It's that Beethoven himself comes through in those scraps in a very persistent way. In other words, the soundtrack doesn't just sit in the background of the show like most TV music. It keeps pushing itself into your consciousness. And the reason why that happens is actually Beethoven's fault, not the guys who created the soundtrack. Beethoven does that. He forces his way forward. He's not a background kind of a guy. So his musical material is insistent and it comes to the front. And that's what happens in the show. And I found it, compelling the way that happened. There's also a delightful moment in the first episode when David Mitchell is reaching a point where something is coming together in a sort of eureka moment, and we suddenly hear Beethoven's Ninth, just played straight. And that's another thing I like in the show, is sometimes Beethoven comes into the room, as it were. It's terrific. There's another moment when that happens in another episode where a crime has been committed in a church, so we're hearing music on an organ. And suddenly the Moonlight Sonata is there, and it's being played on an organ. And it's terrifying. It's associated with death. And if you look at my old video about the Moonlight Sonata, you'll realise that there's something true about that. The popular idea that the Moonlight Sonata is about moonlight is nonsense. It's really about death. And the show, Ludwig, has worked that out. And it's terrific. You have the Moonlight Sonata played full volume, and it's terrifying. And I feel as if that really captures the spirit of the music in a curious way. There's another amazing thing. On a building site, you're hearing Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, and then suddenly someone falls off the building, and we hear the storm from the Sixth Symphony. And it's, again, a marvellous moment. And the pairing of the Fifth and the Sixth is actually how the two pieces were originally presented by Beethoven. So somehow the show has got lots right about Beethoven, but it's not being presented in this didactic way. It's just being presented as part of the drama. I just thought that was brilliant. And the main theme is based on the Tempest finale, the famous, which of course is a very obsessive theme. And they try to make it less obsessive by removing the motif a few times, but it still forces its way into consciousness. There's even also a reference to Für Elise, just the semitone figure, that is also so famous that it's used as the reverse noise for garbage trucks in Taiwan. So which I think that sort of tells us something about that must be the most famous piece in the world, surely. So these are all scraps of Beethoven that work their way into the score of Ludwig, and I think they're rather brilliantly done. So those are the two TV shows very quickly discussed. Now, having just talked about Ludwig and the tunes that are used in it, a thought occurred to me, which is that there is a connection between the Für Elise tune and in its later version, which I played in my video, the one that most people don't know about, this one, where the accompaniment comes in on the offbeat. Now that's very, very closely related to the Tempest, which has this, also has a offbeat thing in the left hand if it's played as Beethoven intended it to be. So these marvellous, insistent tunes with this sort of curious rhythmic character. And I was thinking the other day, there's a later tune, you don't hear it in Ludwig, but it's a later melody that Beethoven came up with in 1825 when he wrote, right at the end of his life, when he wrote his amazing A minor string quartet, one of the late quartets. A minor string quartet, opus 132. And he wrote this beautiful melody. For my money, maybe this wins the prize for Beethoven's greatest melody, or at least it is a melody of such beauty that it confounds that old chestnut that Beethoven didn't write great tunes. He really could write a great tune, and this is a wonderful example. It's a string quartet, not a piano piece, but I'll show you how it goes. There's a connection with the Ninth Symphony too, which is that friends of Beethoven wanted him to replace the choral finale of the Ninth Symphony. Imagine that. The famous choral finale that we all know and love, or at least some of us love, with its famous tune, what Stravinsky called a tub-thumping theme. Beethoven's friends said, we're not sure that this works, and Beethoven wasn't sure if it worked either, because the first performance was a bit scrappy. And anyway, it was completely unprecedented to have a chorus in a symphony. So he was contemplating the idea of removing it, of, I think, possibly publishing the finale as a separate piece and replacing it with an instrumental finale. And he began to think about a tune for it. But he, in the end, never did any of that. The tune that he was thinking about as a replacement for the famous Ode to Joy became this theme that I'm about to play to you, the theme that eventually became the finale of his great A minor string quartet, opus 132. So it goes like this, and I think it's like a brother of, in a weird way, a brother or sister or whatever, of Für Elise and the Tempest. It's got a similar character in a way, same sort of offbeat rhythms and similar insistent melody. So wonderful, very difficult to play on the piano because that whole texture is a mesh of string quartet lines. Amazing, isn't it amazing? A genius, I suppose. But I can't, I think when you play something and just say genius, it's lazy, but there we are. It's kind of, there's nothing, it's difficult to distill exactly why it's as beautiful as it is. Maybe one day I'll make a video where we look at that in detail, but it is fabulous. Right, let's talk about genius and different examples. So having looked at Beethoven, let's look at some other examples. And I realise this is such a random presentation, but I hope you'll follow my kind of weird improvisatory route through this topic, because I'm now going to jump to some just sort of literally randomly, as they occur to me, examples of sort of flashes of genius, and they're all very dissimilar probably. So let's talk about Joni Mitchell. I think Joni is this sort of astonishing figure. She's an old lady now, but an incredible pioneering figure, and a songwriter of great quality, wonderful creativity. So just a thought occurred to me, a very simple example from Joni Mitchell's relatively early album, Blue. Well, most people know Blue and know that it's a seminal album from approximately 1970, famously melancholy album and sort of self-confessional in a way, very melancholy. I mean, it's almost unbearable to listen to her bearing her soul the way she does through the album, but marvellously real. And there's a beautiful song in it called California, in E major, where she's playing a Appalachian dulcimer and singing with her wonderful, fresh, young voice, innocent voice, about travelling around in Europe and feeling lonely and all these things. And it just seems to me to capture, let me put it this way, the genius of youth and creativity. And there's a deeply moving moment in the song where the chorus and everything is all beautiful, but then she sings this beautiful line. She sings, oh, with a beautiful voice, not like my gruff old voice. She says, oh, it gets so lonely. And just the use of the secondary dominant there, the F sharp, in relation to E, and you hear, I think she introduces a steel guitar comes in at that moment, so the timbre slightly changes. Very, very subtle, but there's attention to detail, which is part of what genius is, these little details, and the absolute sense that a kind of shroud of melancholy comes over the song at that moment. You have to hear this to believe how impressive, to me anyway, that moment is. Joni Mitchell, and tying in with Joni is this idea of the genius of youth that I mentioned a moment ago, because I work a lot with young people, I teach young people, and I'm so impressed by their creativity and their freshness, and to some extent their innocence. And the fact that actually, if anyone's going to save this world from its dire predicament, it's young people. So I think I do get fed up, I do get deeply irritated by the endless, relentless hostility that young people are barraged with about being, woke and snowflakes and all the rest of it. Give young people a break and let them be the saviours of the world that they have the potential to be. I was so amazed this week. I went to a concert at a rival institution, the Royal Academy, and I heard the Royal Academy's Manson Ensemble, and they were being conducted by this brilliant, kind of unsung but brilliant conductor called Timothy Weiss, who's obviously doing great work with them. And I just noticed the young people were playing so brilliantly. It was new music, brand new music, and they playing a couple of, fantastically virtuosic pieces by Augusta Read Thomas. Incredibly difficult, but the way they were playing it like it was Mozart. They were playing it with every nuance and every gradation of dynamic and wonderful phrasing. They were all, they're probably all under 21, and they were playing it like, they were playing with such intensity. It was something to behold, actually. So well done to them and to Augusta Read Thomas and everyone who's involved in that concert. It was actually a tribute to two old friends of mine, Jane Manning and Tony Payne, also in their different ways touched with genius, I would say. So that little bit of the discussion is really to celebrate young people and the genius of youth. Just to add to that, actually, the genius of youth, just to say it's wonderful seeing young musicians before they get, if I can put it this way, corrupted by sort of the profession and become jaded and sort of cynical and everything. It's so sad, actually, when that happens to musicians. We can all get jaded by the various disappointments and vicissitudes of life as a musician, but it's so important to maintain our freshness and our joy in music somehow. Okay, moving on to the next topic. One thing to say about Joni Mitchell and her amazing creative songwriting, and it's characteristic of the era, it's an era when people were free to be inventive and experimental with their creativity in terms of songwriting. And I know there are songwriters out there today who are also inventive and creative, but we live in an era which is absolutely dominated by a sort of corporate mechanism in which formulae really rule what the general public tend to hear in terms of popular music. And I think it's shocking and terrible that that's the case. And I point my finger at these corporations and say, let people be creative, you formulaic bastards. No, I can't say that, can I? Is that all right to leave it there? On the subject of formulae and the conflict between the individual artist and the corporate network, another thing that I watched this week, sort of not fresh or new in any way, but a film from 1942, was Orson Welles' Magnificent Ambersons, which is a really amazing film, and it's absolutely touched with genius. Again, I'll put the link to the movie in the video description because you can watch it on BBC iPlayer. At the moment, you can watch it on BBC iPlayer. And that film was ruined, in effect, by RKO executives who looked at it while Welles was away filming another film in Brazil, and they absolutely mangled it and re-edited it and shot some new scenes at the end because they didn't like his tragic ending. And so it's an example of genius that's sort of been absolutely mangled. It's an amazing film even so. The genius comes through, but it's not as it ought to be. Okay, that's a quick plug for Orson Welles. Another thing that I listened to and was sharing with students this week was another example of something. We've been talking about the genius of youth, but this is the genius of old age. I was listening to a weird and wonderful piece by the 82-year-old Richard Strauss, written, I think, in 1947. It's his Duett Concertino for clarinet, bassoon, strings and harp. Hardly anyone knows this piece. It's amazing. It's very, very strange. It's the reconciliation, I think the idea in the piece is the reconciliation of, to some extent, the Apollonian and the beautiful in the clarinet. And then with the bassoon, it's kind of grotesque and wrong, and the two are mismatched very clearly at the beginning of the piece. It's such an odd thing to do, but he's sort of set up this, what we would call a dialectic, and gradually the two are reconciled in the finale of the piece until everyone's singing together. It's such a great piece. It's weird but wonderful, and there's a link below to a performance of it. Why do I mention this? I suppose I mention it because Strauss was very old, and the interesting thing about that reconciliation, I think he's saying something to us very relevant, which is that reconciliation in that kind of, you have opposites are being reconciled. That's how dialectic works. You set up a discussion and then you come to some kind of understanding through the argument, through the process of debate. And we live in an era of such polarisation. It's so destructive and disastrous. And I've noticed it even recently on this channel with my discussion with Glenn Gould. I should really clarify, my discussion with Glenn Gould is just me having my own imaginary debate with him, because wouldn't that be fun? Apparently he used to ring people up late at night and have discussions. They were mostly monologues on the phone. But I think the fun thing is to debate with someone that you don't entirely agree with, but you respect them, and there's a respectful dialogue. And that is what we need nowadays. We need dialogue. So Strauss's Duett Concertino, it's a wonderful example of dialogue. It's not about the polarization. It's not about taking sides. Nowadays you can't do anything without being tribal about it and taking a side. We don't need that. What we need to do is have more understanding of different ideas. So that's what Strauss's Duett Concertino is giving us. And then just to jump to two final examples, because one of them is something that we've done on the channel, so I'll put the link for you. It's a little example of collaborative genius, which comes from the 1950s when Duke Ellington and Ella Fitzgerald, the Ellington Band and Ella Fitzgerald, recorded Caravan. And we made a little film about it, must be at least a year ago, on this channel. But it's a tiny example of how the collaborative energy of a group of musicians can create something absolutely astonishing, scintillating, the chemistry between them at that moment. And only at that moment, and the spontaneity of that recording session. It just happens. So again, have a listen to that and see what you think about that synergy that happens between them. The other tiny example that struck me in a conversation with a student this week was when we happened to be talking about fugue, and I mentioned the incredible final fugue from Benjamin Britten's Young Person's Guide to the Orchestra. Britten actually wrote it as a musical education piece, actually for a TV show. The theme itself is by Henry Purcell, and he has every instrument of the orchestra play a different variation on the theme, accompanied by the orchestra. Sometimes groups of instruments like the percussion, or I think that all four horns play together. But it's kind of cool, and he goes through the entire orchestra that way. But the real kind of pièce de résistance of the piece is the final fugue. It's an interesting thing, this, isn't it? That I think genius, if you like, can sometimes, it's not necessarily that everything's perfect en route, but when you really need to deliver something amazing, you do it at the right moment, and Britten does it at the right moment with the fugue at the end, which is just prodigiously astonishing. I can't tell you how amazing it is. The orchestration is absolutely perfect. The way he brings in all the instruments in a perfect order, absolutely clearly, from the piccolo all the way down the score, all the way down. Until you end up with the brass coming in. And it starts off, it's got this whole tone thing, starting with the piccolo, so it gives the fugue subject very, very high up, like this. And you can hear it's dropped down a tone, then another tone, then another tone, and then it lands on B, and then the flutes come in. and they do they play the subject a fifth lower, and then it comes in again, a fifth lower in the oboes, a fifth lower on the clarinets, and so it goes on down. And it's amazing, and I can't begin to play it on the piano. And then eventually, the whole orchestra has joined in, and it's absolutely, all these counterpoints flying about. And then he does this absolutely spectacular thing where the brass come in. I think anyone else would surely have just made them come in this grand way at a sort of half speed thing. What he does is he puts the whole thing in 3/4 where it's been in 2/4 before. So everyone is carrying on as, you know, playing the fugal material, but the brass come in this absolutely extraordinary other time, absolutely polymetric to the way the fugue is behaving. It has this literally stomach churning effect on the listener, and the kind of grinding of gears that occurs at that moment is stupendous. I don't know anything like it. It's a spectacular thing to do, a kind of awe-inspiring piece of compositional virtuosity, just sort of unleashed in this almost casual way. It's a magnificent thing. And for me, it's an illustration of how genius can work. It's just this, you flick a switch and a window opens into something that you could never have imagined or expected. And yet when you hear it, it's absolutely right. So there we go. A few reflections on genius. I had a student in one of my classes a few years ago who told me that there is no such thing as genius, and that it was, I don't know, patriarchal, to use the term. And I'm really sorry if that's how it seems, but I don't see it that way. I think Francis Ford Coppola was right in a way at the beginning in signalling out that as a species we have potential genius as a species, and we need to, you know, celebrate genius. Let's not celebrate mediocrity, which I think is what the music industry does with its formulae, and the film industry also. Formulae are tedious. Real human creativity is surprising and wonderful, and uses conventions in a new way and in a surprising way. So anyway, this is all about celebrating creativity, celebrating human excellence. It's something we need to think about, because the world's depressing at the moment and we need to make it into a better place. So thanks for watching. Please let me know your thoughts. I'm really sorry that today's discussion has been so crazy all over the place, but I do think somewhere in all that there is a discussion about creativity and about excellence and about genius that needs to be had. And I value, as always, your comments. I'll try to interact with as many as I can. And as always, I want to thank you, my audience, for watching these videos, and thank you so much for your support, and thanks for watching.